so pleased not only with the honor of being your MC today, it's also just fantastic to look at the numbers and hear about the numbers of people who are here today. I gather that there are 280 attendees, which is an absolute record. They sold out as of Thursday and had to turn many, many, many people away. And I think that is a real testimony to the ability of Dalhousie and particularly the ITIS services to get the word out, but also testimony to the fact of, I think, the significant number of things that have happened in the last year since we all gathered here a year ago that have brought privacy issues again to the forefront. We've seen the introduction in Parliament of legislation attempting to modernize or bring up to date PIPEDA after its second 5-year review, or after, I guess, its first 5-year review, but 10 years in the making, that would put in place privacy breach notification requirements in the law that currently languishing in Parliament to follow Alberta's lead, and we'll hear from Jill Clayton on that. Probably first or the most significant privacy story of the last year has been Bill C-30, the Protecting Children from Internet Predators Act, the so-called, that prompted an enormous backlash when the intrusiveness of this legislation came to light, resulting in thousands and thousands of people tweeting, going on Facebook, signing petitions and things like that. And then most recently, and I did hear somebody cynically suggest that perhaps every year we should arrange for a massive data breach in December, just as they're getting the word out about Data Privacy Day. One only has to think about the HRSDC breaches, the 2 of them related to tens of thousands of individuals and their information about their disabilities and their health information, promptly followed by the revelation, also on a late Friday afternoon by a press release, of over 500,000 student loan recipients, which probably hits particularly close to home for people in the university community. But whatever it is that prompted the number of people to show interest and to attend, it's only for the best, because we were having a discussion prior to the start that awareness of privacy issues is such an important thing that every day, and probably more and more often, it's accelerating, that people are making choices about their personal information and how it's collected, used, and disclosed. And privacy is fundamentally about making choices, and you're not able to make choices unless, number one, you know you have a choice, and 2, you're able to make that choice in an informed manner. And so I think that this event, Data Privacy Day generally around the world, is such an important event in order to focus attention on privacy, and I'm so pleased that it's happening to such a huge magnitude here in Halifax and here at Dalhousie.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, David. And thank you also very much to Dalhousie University and the conference organizers and sponsors for putting on this event today. We're acknowledging and raising awareness for Data Privacy Day, and I think that, which I think officially is January 28th every year, and I think it's a really important opportunity to promote the value of personal information and protecting personal information, and also to acknowledge the impact that technology is having on privacy. I would also like in particular to thank John Bullock of Dalhousie University. John and I met at a privacy and security conference in Victoria last year, just about exactly a year ago, and I appreciate that he followed up with an invitation for me to be here today to speak to you. John tells me also that he used to work in Edmonton in the same building where my office is right now, so we have that in common, but he'll also know that I appreciate the invitation to be here in Nova Scotia because yesterday in Edmonton it was -39 with the wind chill, so it's balmy here, positively balmy. And I would also like to acknowledge my colleague Dulcie McCallum. I don't know where she is in the room at the moment. Oh, there she is, Dulcie, who is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Review Officer for Nova Scotia. And Dulcie is a very gracious, collaborative, and supportive colleague, and she's tremendously committed to access and privacy work here in Nova Scotia, but she is also a real presence and voice at the table for national access and privacy issues. So, and she's graciously hosting a reception today, so thank you very much for that, Dulcie, and just a little acknowledgement for Dulcie and the work she does here. Thank you. So I thought that I Are we advancing? There we go. Now we're advancing. So a quick little overview. It's not advancing. It's advanced here.
Do you mind? Sorry.
Should I try that?
No, have to move the mouse. Oh dear.
I could just click with the mouse.
Oh, here we go. Ta-da. Okay, and let's go to slideshow.
Again, technological challenges,
Oh, I know.
which is interesting because a lot of what I'm going to talk about are some issues and trends that we see in privacy, and the underlying theme of all of them is the role that technology plays. So,
Here we go.
thank you. So if I just use the mouse key, do you think that will work? Okay. All right, we'll give it a go. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. Just so you have a little bit of a sense of who I am and what we do in Alberta, I'll spend just a couple of minutes talking about that. I'll talk a little bit about why privacy matters and use a couple of concrete examples. David has also already alluded to some of those, and so I won't spend too much time on that. But I will spend some time talking about trends and issues that we're seeing around privacy, certainly in Alberta, and you'll see that Alberta is not unique, that all of the jurisdictions are dealing with many of the same issues, and I think that ultimately what I'm trying to do is point to where we're going and the interconnectedness of information systems and the prevalence of privacy issues and how very important protecting privacy and valuing personal information is and should be for all of us. And then if I have time, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about accountability, and I'll explain what that's about when I get there. So first of all, and it's working. In Alberta, as Information and Privacy Commissioner, I'm an independent officer of the legislature. We have 6. That includes the Auditor General, it includes the Chief Electoral Officer, the Ethics Commissioner, and others. So I report directly to the Legislative Assembly and am independent of government. I'm very fortunate. Alberta has a fairly good-sized staff doing this sort of work. I have 40 people in offices in both Edmonton and Calgary. And we provide oversight for 3, both access to information but privacy statutes. The first was the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, so that's our public sector legislation. And again, it's about access to information as well as protecting individual privacy. That was our first statute. The Health Information Act came in just over 10 years ago now. That is standalone health information legislation. It applies to all of the health services providers in the province. And in 2004, we introduced the Personal Information Protection Act. And as David had said earlier, that is provincial private sector legislation that applies to private sector businesses. The mandate of the office, what we're mainly involved in or have been involved in for a number of years is, again, providing oversight and in a way being reactive. We mediate requests for review, so when individuals are trying to access their own personal information, or in the case of government, if they're looking for access to government information, they're not happy with the response they get, then they can come to our office and we'll take a look at that and try to resolve it. We also investigate privacy complaints under all 3 statutes, so that involves the a complaint about, for example, the collection, use, and disclosure of information. Too much of my information was collected, it wasn't properly secured, it was disclosed to somebody in the workplace or disclosed externally. In Alberta, we also are a quasi-judicial tribunal, so we do have an adjudication unit that hears inquiries. If we're not able to resolve something informally through mediation and investigation, then we do have a team of adjudicators who can hear a matter and issue binding orders. We're also responsible to provide advice and recommendations to our stakeholders, so the public sector, public bodies, private sector organizations, and health custodians. We consult with the public and have a mandate to inform the public about access and privacy issues. We have a research mandate. I spend a fair amount of time, in particular when the House is sitting, commenting on existing or proposed legislation and programs. The and programs piece, I think, is important. In Alberta, we're the only jurisdiction where under our health legislation, health custodians have a legal responsibility to submit privacy impact assessments to my office for review before they implement a new information system. It's a model that's not mimicked in exactly the same way in any other jurisdiction, and is an interesting model perhaps for the other sectors. And we also spend a lot of time, particularly through that PIA review process, commenting on record linkages and data matching. And again, that's going to be a bit of a theme as I get going here today. Again, I've also already said that we do have this ability. We're not an ombudsman model. We do have binding order-making power, so that the power to compel compliance with the legislation, and orders issued by the office are only reviewable on. There's no appeal. You can apply for a judicial review, which many parties do. We end up in the courts a fair bit. So that's a little of an overview of Alberta. It's a little bit different from each jurisdiction is quite unique, but we do have those 3 statutes. Interestingly, for me, as a relatively new commissioner now, I don't think I can play the new commissioner card for too much longer, given that my 1-year anniversary is coming up pretty quick. We're in the process of making a few changes to the office to focus more on some of the proactive activities that we might be able to do, as opposed to being reactive, as I said, to the kinds of waiting for individuals to come in with complaints. And again, I think you might see why we're doing that as I talk a little bit more about some of the issues that are facing us. So very quickly, a couple of examples of why privacy matters. So again, David has already mentioned this one, the missing hard drive, with the HRSDC missing hard drive. So I think we first started to hear about this, I think initially it was the loss of the USB stick containing social insurance numbers and medical information, which can be some of the very most sensitive information. And that involved personal information of about 5,000 people. While that was under investigation, it came to light that an external hard drive had gone missing with personal information of almost 600,000 people. That's a lot of individuals to be affected by a breach. And that personal information included student names, dates of birth, social insurance numbers, addresses, and student loan balances. At this point, I know that the Federal Privacy Commissioner is investigating, and she's been public about that. I know of 3 class action suits that have flowed from this incident. I think there might be a 4th. I'm looking to David, he's nodding. Seems every day we hear about another one. So there are very real consequences to failure to properly protect personal information. So that's one example. And that was a public sector example, and it's much in the news, so that's why I wanted to include it. This second example, I was just reading about this. Sony Computer Entertainment has been fined £250,000 by the UK Information Commissioner. And I think this is interesting. I don't know who will remember this. The incident actually happened back in 2011, and it was actually David did mention that in Alberta, in our private sector, since 2010, there has been a positive legal duty for organizations to report certain breaches to my office, and it's an offense not to report a breach where it gives rise to a real risk of significant harm to an individual or individuals. And this was actually something that had been reported to our office, and we dealt with that. And as I recall, my predecessor, Frank Work, had published a news release about it at the time. The reason I've put it up there today is because I had just seen a news release making reference to the fact that the UK Commissioner had completed their investigation, and because of this fine. So in Alberta, we don't have that ability to fine organizations in the wake of an incident, but other jurisdictions do have that ability. As I understand it, Sony is going to be appealing that decision, but again, we're starting class action suits and fines. We're starting to see some real financial consequences, or the potential for financial consequences for data breach incidents. And I know the Federal Privacy Commissioner has also been talking about the need for to be able to assess fines for particularly egregious breach incidents, so we'll see what happens with that. Another example, and again, David and I were talking to a journalism student before the event today got going, and we were talking about Bill C-30. And I wanted to put that one up there. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just as a reminder that, or to get away from the idea of incidents, because privacy impacts us in all sorts of different ways. And what I think is interesting about the lawful access legislation that was introduced last year on Valentine's Day, ironically, I suppose, the Protecting Children from Internet Predators Act, is that this has been in the works for a long, long time. Many, many bills have been introduced, and none of them have actually gone anywhere. The new version had certain things that were an improvement on previous iterations, but there are still many concerns around warrantless access, not limiting, no longer limiting provision of information to police to where reasonable grounds. And this is the sort of legislation that could affect all of us here in this room. And the thing that I found most interesting about the backlash to the government's bill is that people often ask me, do young people care about privacy at all? They're constantly putting information out on social media sites, and they're blogging, and they're sharing all sorts of intimate details about themselves, and they obviously don't care, is usually how it's put to me. And what I found interesting about the response to Bill C-30 is that given there had been these previous iterations of similar bills, the reaction was not as strong. But this time, there were privacy commissioners who were speaking out, of course, and civil libertarians and other privacy experts. But the citizenry was really engaged and saw that this legislation could impact them individually. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that the bill has been pulled. And it might yet come back, but at the moment, you know, we seem to, it's gone, it's receded, I suppose, no longer looming. And the fourth example, concrete example that I wanted to talk about today is what I call unauthorized access by authorized users. And Alberta, again, we have standalone health information legislation. Way back in 2007, we actually laid charges under the Health Information Act for somebody who had gone in and accessed, you know, there's always some sort of love triangle kind of thing. Someone's looking up the ex-husband of so-and-so, that kind of thing. Anyway, that was the first successful prosecution under the Health Information Act in Alberta, and that resulted in a fine of $10,000. We did it again with releasing a news release last December, not 2012, but 2011, another successful prosecution. This one usually tends to grab people. In this case, it was an Alberta pharmacist who was looking up, had again, there's a love interest here, had some interest in a gentleman at her church, as I understand it, and was concerned that other women in the church group might be competitors for his affection. So had looked up some information about, in particular, one woman, and then took some of that medical information and posted it on Facebook. And she also went in and accessed information of other individuals. So ultimately, that resulted in a fine of $15,000 under the Health Information Act, but it also resulted in a similar fine under her, from her professional association. So, and obviously a suspension of, I believe her license was revoked. So there can be very real consequences. I don't like to see incidents like this, but I do think it's important that certainly in that case, and in the next one that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, especially in the health sector, where what you tell your healthcare provider is incredibly personal health information. Having trust in our health system, particularly when we're trying to advance electronic health records, if you think that just anybody can go in and look up your information, that's obviously going to have an effect on how much information or how openly you discuss your medical issues with your healthcare provider. And one of the things I was talking about that my office did on Monday of this week for Data Privacy Day, we issued a publication on Netcare and know your rights as a patient, that you do get to know what's in Netcare, which is the provincial electronic health record. You can ask what information is in there. You can ask why it's been collected. You can ask who has access to it. You can also ask for a copy of your audit log so you can see who has been accessing your information. And in the third case that's just in the last bullet there, somebody did just that, obtained a copy of their access log, came to my office, and as a result, a formal offense investigation was commenced. And just this last year, we laid 34 charges under the Health Information Act for unauthorized access to health information, and an additional 6 criminal charges were also laid. So those charges haven't been proven. There's a publication ban on any details about that, but we're expecting that to go forward. But again, there can be some pretty serious consequences, as there should be for that kind of activity. So those are some concrete examples. I thought that just generally, as I mentioned, as a relatively new in my position, we spent a fair amount of time towards the end of last year getting involved in business planning and figuring out where the heck we're going to go in the next, over the next, well, I guess 4 years now that's left of my term. And as part of that, I thought it was really important that we take a look at some of the trends, environmental trends and issues. And certainly there are people who are going to be speaking to you today who are going to go into a lot more detail on a couple of these things. But I think, and I've been saying this to the folks in my office, because the way my office is set up right now, we have these individual teams of people for the public sector, for the health sector, and for the private sector. And they do great work in their own spheres, but I'm trying to encourage them to talk more amongst themselves, because somebody might be looking at cloud computing issues in the public sector, and those same issues are very, very relevant and pressing in the private sector, as they are in the health sector as well. So we've been looking at all of these things that we see going on, and looking for the connections and trying to get a sense of where things are going, and that's what I thought I would share a little bit with you today, just sort of that overall picture, and then talk to you a little bit about some of my concerns as a result of that. So we've already talked to the use of the internet and social media and individuals who are putting more and more information about themselves online every day. Just as an aside to that, I was on vacation recently, and I'd gone to Mexico, and I sat down to do a little bit of light reading, and I picked up a copy of Vanity Fair magazine, and there was an article in there about the quantified self movement. Has anybody in this room heard of the quantified self movement? Couple of hands, not a lot of hands, but it's interesting to me that anybody would do this. But the person who was writing the article was talking about how he's got all sorts of devices connected to him, and they're recording everything from the number of breaths that he takes to the number of hours a night that he gets REM sleep versus not quite such a deep sleep, to the number of footsteps that he takes a day, to the number of emails he receives and the number of emails that he sends. Like, every aspect of his life is being tracked and monitored, and he's talking about this and blogging about it. And for my own part, I can't imagine why anybody would want to do that, or why anybody would be interested in that, the minutia of his life. But that's taking this idea of sharing information about ourselves individually to a whole new extreme. But of course, that is what's happening, and that individuals are sharing all of that information, but increasingly governments and private sector organizations are collecting that information. They want that information. And certainly every conference I've been at for the last couple of years, we're talking about big data. Big data, not just in the volumes of information that are available, but the exceptional technologies that allow that information to be analyzed in ways we've never seen before. And no longer are we asking questions of our data, but now we have algorithms that can mash the data and analyze the data, and it's presenting new and different scenarios to us in ways we've never before contemplated. I've already spoken a bit about electronic health records. Again, in Alberta, it's not just in the health sector. In policing, for example, and in other sorts of government programs, we're seeing the interconnectedness of systems. So the provincial electronic health record in Alberta, it used to be in 1999 it was, only 5% of physician offices had electronic medical record systems. Now, over 50% of them do. And information from all of those individual systems and all the other provincial independent databases, all being linked together into this interconnected system that is accessed through what I've already referred to, which is Netcare. Not all the information, but certain information. But these systems are designed to be interoperable, to be interconnected, to allow for the information to come together. Remember, we've already talked about big data just a little bit. But it's also not confined just to Alberta. The idea ultimately is to be able to connect these systems to systems in other jurisdictions as well. We're seeing similar things in government. I've got up on the slide multi-agency citizen-centered service delivery. So instead of individual government departments collecting information about a citizen in order to provide a program or service, there's definitely a move afoot in Alberta to link the public sector to the health sector to the private sector in order to bring the people who need to be involved in providing a service together, and that requires information sharing, and we've seen a lot of that in other jurisdictions as well, and certainly nationally as well. I know in BC, for example, this idea that citizens should only have to go to government once, provide their information once, and everybody who needs it to provide a program or service will have access to that information. The citizen won't have to provide it over and over and over again. So there's a strong move, certainly in Alberta, also nationally, but also internationally, to change the way that government does business, to make it more efficient and effective and provide better services, but that involves linking all of these sectors together. Open government and open data. I don't know how many people here are all that familiar with open government and open data. That's more of an access issue and about pushing information out and proactively disclosing information to the people. The reason I wanted to, just to make reference to that, is because there are also privacy issues associated with that. The open data movement in particular, again, a global movement. A couple of provinces have gone a long ways down the open data road. Alberta is poised to do exactly the same thing. Open data in particular is about pushing information out in machine-readable format. The idea is that it is machine-readable. It can be mashed up with data sets from other jurisdictions, internationally from jurisdictions, and who knows what will come of that. It's putting the information out there to see what will come of that. When you start pushing information out like that, though, there are potentially privacy issues. You might think that the information has been de-identified, but when you start to match the data sets together, how do you guarantee anonymity? Citizen engagement, we've talked about that a little bit already. Government 2.0, engaging with the citizens. Everybody wants to hear from citizens, but that involves collecting information from citizens and possibly linking it into all of these other systems. The mobility of technology. You know, I, again, in my first year, thought that it would be helpful to get a little bit of a baseline about about some of the trends and issues that are of concern to stakeholders in the province. So we did a stakeholder survey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we asked stakeholders, the public sector, private sector, health sector, what are the big issues that are affecting them? Right up there is protecting personal information and the increasing mobility of technology. Everybody's got a tablet and an iPad and a smartphone, and there's an awful lot of, and USB sticks and external hard drives, and there's an awful lot of information contained on those mobile devices, and when they go missing, well, we've talked about the consequences already. Cloud computing, I know we're going to hear about that later on today. Again, you know, it's not that cloud computing hasn't been around for a long, long time. Some of the early medical record systems that were introduced in Alberta used a cloud computing kind of technology, but we're starting to see it more. We've now attached this label to it, and there are all sorts of efficiencies as a result, but there are all sorts of potential privacy and security risks as well. And then as everything comes together into these systems and everything is interconnected and interoperable and information is being shared all over the place and individuals should only have to go once to one place, how do you authenticate people? How do you identify them? And so I know that there are moves afoot in Alberta, but also in other jurisdictions to figure out how to identify people. But again, not just within a particular program, but across government services, and not just within a particular jurisdiction, but what if somebody is applying for services in other jurisdictions, and then internationally. So there's a lot of work that's going on around that, and obviously there are some potential issues with that. And as I mentioned to begin with, all of these things that we're seeing out there, the one common denominator, it's either pushing it or pulling it, I'm not exactly sure, probably a combination of both, is technology. All of these things, technology is the underlying force behind all of these trends. So, implications for access and privacy. Well, governance and accountability. It's not actually it's one of my big issues. Particularly when you see all of this information coming together in these interconnected systems, who's responsible for it? And how do I, as a regulator, if there's an issue, who do I go to when there are all of these different contributors to a system? Transparency, this actually might be my biggest concern. Do individuals have any idea that all of this is going on, about their information being collected as part of big data, or about the information that government is collecting and sharing, and what goes on in Alberta's electronic health record? As I mentioned, we just published this document on know your rights for Netcare. I remember just starting in my new position and going out and talking to a whole bunch of healthcare providers. And some of them, they're the sophisticated users of the Alberta Netcare system. Some of them didn't know what information was in Netcare, or how it got there, or where it came from, or their rights, or that individuals could ask to have some of their information masked. So the systems are so complex and sophisticated, and if the users of the system are having a hard time figuring out how to put it together and how to use it properly, how do individuals keep on top of this? How do individuals know what's going on with their personal information such that they're able to exercise their rights under privacy laws? So that's one of my big concerns. I have other concerns around legislative authority to share information, particularly, again, if we've got these cross-sectoral initiatives. In Alberta, as I mentioned, in the Health Information Act, there's a mandatory requirement to submit a PIA to my office before going ahead with an information system. That doesn't apply in the public sector or the private sector. So if you've got a cross-sectoral initiative and only one player has a duty under the legislation, how am I making sure that I'm getting the whole picture when a PIA comes to my office? Breach reporting, as I mentioned, under our private sector legislation, private sector organizations have a positive duty to report certain incidents to the office. Not true under the public sector legislation or under the health legislation. So anyway, when you see these kinds of initiatives coming together, they become increasingly complex. Who's going to deal with a breach? Who's going to report it? Who's going to notify individuals? Who's going to take responsibility for it? What if an individual wants to access their information in the system? Who do they go to? This walked through the door just the other day, an individual who had been using a number of social service agencies in Alberta, all nonprofits. In Alberta, some nonprofits for particular transactions, they're covered under legislation. Sometimes they're not covered under legislation. This gentleman's information ended up in a giant database, essentially. And there's information in there from hundreds of different agencies and public sector groups. And where does he go? He wants to know what information about him is in there. Who does he go to? Who does he ask? Who does he submit his request to? And of course, when you have all of this information together like that, it's very, very tempting to use it for a new purpose now that you have it. Sometimes it's the kind of thing that people expect to see. For example, in the health environment, I think a lot of people wouldn't have a problem if their health information was being used for research purposes. They would expect that there are protocols in place to make sure that that happens properly and according to the legislation. We do have rules in Alberta in the health information legislation about how information is used for research purposes. But what about for law enforcement? Increasingly, we're seeing probably a good example of this in Alberta recently. So a bill was introduced, it didn't go forward, but the scrap metal dealers legislation. So I don't know if most people are aware that in lots of jurisdictions across Canada, there's a real issue with thieves making off with copper wire and that kind of any kind of metal, and taking it to scrap metal dealers and usually, in many cases, stolen property and getting money for it. So there was a bill introduced in Alberta that the scrap metal dealers would have to collect a fairly significant amount of information about the individuals who come in to sell that information. We see a lot of that, this deputizing of the private sector to collect information, ostensibly for one purpose, but in many cases making it available for law enforcement purposes. And of course, those large databases of information give rise to all these incidents of identity theft and fraud. We're starting to get a pretty good handle on the kinds of breaches that occurred because of the mandatory reporting under our private sector legislation, and lots of voluntary reporting in the other sectors as well. A lot of breach incidents are the result of human error, and a lot of them are related to transmission errors, so mailing and faxing problems and emails and things like that. But of course, there are those large database hacks and phishing attempts. And when you're talking about an electronic database of information that's being hacked into, the volumes, the numbers of people who are affected by a breach like that can be very, very significant. So again, as we see information coming together in these, the more sharing of it and the interconnectedness of information, it gives rise to even more concerns about what happens if that information is accessed by unauthorized users. And then, of course, I've already talked about when the information is accessed by authorized users, but for unauthorized purposes, and I've described already what's going on in Alberta, which isn't to say that most people, certainly in the health sector, are very ethical and they know their responsibilities, but there's always a percentage of people who will go in and access information that they don't have a right to see or a business need to see. That just speaks to what do you do to prevent that, the education and training side of things, auditing capabilities. And I've got access to information on there as well because, again, we're also seeing in Alberta, the Alberta government, Alberta Health, is moving towards introducing a self-serve portal so individuals will be able to access their own information in Netcare. Not all of it right away, but in a phased rollout. And that also leads to all sorts of concerns. And again, back to authenticating individuals and verifying identities. And then, of course, the challenges of data anonymization. If you're putting information out there, I've already mentioned that. It was interesting, I was talking to somebody at a Data Privacy Day event on Monday who was telling me that some information that was going out based on postal code. And he was concerned because in his postal code area, there are only 5 people, and the information that was going out could potentially have identified his daughter, the only under 5-year-old female. So again, you put information out, identifying it or thinking that it's anonymized, and sometimes there are unintended consequences. So again, those are some of the implications for access and privacy. Not to be all doom and gloom, this is where I thought I would put in a little bit of a plug for accountability. Last year, my office, the British Columbia office, and the Federal Privacy Commissioner's office introduced or published a document called Getting Accountability Right with a Privacy Management Framework. So here's my plug. To avoid incidents, to make sure that you are in fact handling information properly, this is a document to say, here's what you need to do, here's how you set it up in your organization, in your public body. It was actually geared towards the private sector, but it certainly has applicability across all sectors. And it's a fairly long document. It's available on my website and on the websites of the Federal Commissioner and BC as well. But what it comes down to is very simply build this thing, and we've outlined the building blocks, and then maintain it. So around building it, the first of the building blocks is organizational commitment. If you are one of those entities that is collecting personal information, you have to have the proper privacy framework in place. And that includes organizational commitment, which means buy-in from the top, establishing a privacy officer or identifying a privacy officer, making sure that you have an adequately staffed and resourced privacy office, and making sure that you have the proper reporting structures in place so that when an incident happens, people know where to go, and that gets escalated up to senior management. On the slide, you'll see, I've got some percentage marks there. I mentioned earlier that we'd done a stakeholder survey, and we took, as part of that survey, we took this accountability document, and then we asked all the respondents whether or not they felt that they had solid senior management support, whether or not they had appointed a privacy officer, whether or not they had adequately staffed their privacy office. And I just put the numbers up there because that's what it looks like in Alberta right at the moment. There's a perception on the part of the stakeholders that there's a lot of buy-in from the top. Most of them have privacy officers identified. The percentages that you see there in red are anytime anything got around 50% or lower, I put it up there in red. So it was interesting to me that 87% of stakeholders thought they had solid buy-in and support from senior management, but only 56% of them thought that they were adequately staffed or resourced. So I don't know how you reconcile that. Few of them had implemented an internal program to, in an ongoing way, sort of monitor compliance with privacy policies. The second building block is to have program controls in place. A personal information inventory. You know, when I first started doing access and privacy work, I got into it by going around doing personal information inventories for public sector organizations that were about to come under our Freedom of Information legislation. And you can't comply with legislation if you don't know what you have or where it is. It's interesting to me that all of these years later, only 48% of them actually have an inventory of their personal information. Also, program controls, it's important to have certain policies in place that give effect to the legislation. So policies around collecting, using, disclosing information, granting access, how are you going to do that, proper disposal of information, those sorts of things. Risk assessment tools, the importance of the privacy impact assessment. We found that only 26% of our stakeholders in Alberta actually had a policy and procedure for doing PIAs in place. But I'll tell you, interestingly, across the board, when you look at the responses and you look for correlations between responses, the organizations that had the strongest privacy who answered, yes, we've got a privacy officer, yes, we do this, yes, we do that, we've got a very mature and robust privacy framework in place. The strongest correlation is to having a PIA policy in place. So those that, I don't know which way it works, you're either doing PIA, so you've got a strong privacy framework in place, or part of your privacy framework is putting the PIA policy in place, but it was interesting. But across the board, I think a lot of work needs to happen in our jurisdiction to encourage all of the stakeholders in all of the sectors to be doing privacy impact assessments. Training and education, also particularly low. I was surprised at that. Breach response incident management protocols. Only 51% of our stakeholders actually had those in place, and that number goes up significantly for the private sector, which I thought was interesting, and not surprising given the mandatory breach reporting requirement. Service provider management, a really important part of a privacy management framework is to know when your information is going to service providers, or service providers are capturing information for you, and documenting your flows outside of Canada. A number of years ago, when Alberta's private sector legislation was amended, it was amended to include a requirement that organizations tell people when their information was going outside of Canada. Everybody was all talking about the new breach reporting requirements under the legislation and saying, oh, this is really going to hit businesses hard. And I said, no, it's this service provider thing. None of them have any idea what information they have or where it's going. It wasn't as sexy, it didn't get as much attention. Clearly, I think they're dealing with that by not actually complying with the legislation, perhaps. Anyway, so those are a couple of examples of how you build a privacy management framework. And then the second part of the document is about maintaining it. So essentially have a plan to maintain it, go back and regularly check, assess and update all of those program controls I've already talked about. So the reason I wanted just to talk about that is partly to give a little plug to that. If you're working for any entity that is collecting personal information, it's a great document that sort of sets out what you might need to do to set up your privacy management framework, and also to move it beyond setting it up to how do I maintain it, how do I make sure that it's growing and that it's a mature program. I think that is tremendously important as we see all of those issues and trends, more sharing of information, collecting more information, individuals putting more information out there, and ensuring that individuals are aware of the consequences of sharing their information. You'll see some of these program controls also have to do with a communications program, so you're telling people how they can access information, find out what's happening with their information that your entity is collecting about them. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there's a lot going on. Every time I pick up the newspaper and read a story, there's some privacy implication, it seems, to almost everything that is going on. And I think one of the best ways to deal with that is to ensure that that those entities that are collecting that information have this kind of framework in place to make sure they're managing it properly. So partly, I'm sharing the results of our survey also and where we're at in Alberta, because that gives me an idea of where, as a regulator, we need to focus some of our efforts on educating the stakeholders to make sure that they do have that framework in place. ideally, that will reduce the number of complaints that are coming to my office, and I can go out there and I can check to make sure that that framework is in place in a more proactive way rather than waiting for the complaints to come into the office, because again, that's what we have been doing, and I think that that doesn't really work anymore given how complex and sophisticated information flows and information systems are today. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I saw 2 minutes. Can I take a question or two, or is there time for that? If anybody has any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing that. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today and the opportunity to be here and to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Alberta. I think you'll find that a lot of the issues and the trends that I was speaking about that we're very aware of in Alberta are also the same sorts of things that you'll see in Nova Scotia, you'll see in British Columbia and Ontario and all the other provinces and internationally. It'll be interesting to see where all of this goes in the next couple of years. Thank you very much.